Hey, welcome back. And as always, I'm just so glad that you're here joining me for this conversation. I want to start today with a staff or production planning meeting scenario. So, this is a meeting you're about to walk into. Could be a staff meeting, depending on the size of your staff and what you do. Could be a production planning meeting. It could be a problem solving meeting, but something like that. And I want you to hear this conversation not as something that happens to other churches, but as something that may be happening in your church as you walk into the meeting. So you're in the meeting. Someone at the table says, "We've been doing the same thing for a while. Maybe it's time to try something different." And you know what happens? The room nods. Nobody pushes back on that because honestly, everybody is a little bit tired of what you've been doing. And it isn't that it isn't working, but we're just a little tired with the current approach. And here's what's crazy, and I love this. No one wants to push back on and say, well, this is how we always do it, or this is our way of doing it, because everybody subtly knows that's like a demotion conversation, right? Demotivating. No one looks at that person and says, hey, I bet they'll be the next leader. I mean, the idea of doing things the way we've always done it because that's how we've always done it, we all know that that is no way to grow anything. So nobody pushes back when somebody says, maybe we should change something. And, and that's where a working system starts getting killed. Okay, this is really critical to kind of remember. It gets killed not because it failed, but because the people running it get bored. And that's what I want to talk about today. So I want to give this kind of drift a name because I think naming it is the first step to watching it and seeing it in reality. I like to call it the law of diminishing astonishment. The law of diminishing astonishment. You may have heard the business or economic concept called the law of diminishing returns. Think of this as the exact same way, but it's more about how people in charge can become bored executing something that might even be working. So here's what it means for people like us, right? The longer that you run a system of any kind, right, the less impressive it feels to the people running it. Not because the system stopped working, but just because familiarity has eroded your ability to kind of feel the impact that the system or the approach, the model, is still having. Like, think about the first time, maybe a sermon series, like you have a new approach to doing a series. So think about the first time that approach landed the way that you hoped it would, and you felt it, right? And the energy in the room was so great. The conversations afterwards, you can still remember them. Like the people who came back and they said it was because of, not because of the new way you thought about the model. They didn't say it that way. But you heard between the lines. You could read between the lines. Your approach worked. It was new. It was great, right? And you could feel both of those things at the same time. Now, fast forward 6 months, 9 months. You've been inside this system for a long time now that the astonishment to you is gone. And when astonishment wanes, restlessness fills that space, right? And that restlessness, if it is not named, starts making decisions that look like a vision, right? But they're really just boredom relief. And listen, this is a leadership issue. It's a leadership problem. And it's one of the most expensive mistakes that a growth-minded pastor can make. So here's what I really do want you to understand about your own experience of your church, okay? You have been thinking about Sunday since Monday. You've been planning 6 days in advance for years and years since you've been a pastor, right? Since you've been in ministry. You've been in every planning conversation, every debrief, every revision cycle. So by the time that weekend arrives, you have lived inside of this content or this system for a long, long time, right? I was going to say for 40 hours, but it's usually more, way more than that. So the average attender, by the way, think about this average person who shows up. They showed up on Sunday, they experienced the hour or the hour and a half, and then they went home. And that's the entirety of their contact with you and what you spent 5 days, 6 days refining, right? They are not saturated. And guess what? They are not bored, okay? What you are exhausted by is still brand new to the person who finally came back for the second time 4 weeks later. Like what you have outgrown is still landing for someone in row 4, right? Or row 44 who almost didn't even show back up. And so this matters enormously when you are sitting in a room considering whether to change something. And you know me, I am all for making things better and changing things. I thrive on that. But we want to change things when a system isn't working. Because when a working system gets replaced prematurely, it's your attenders who are going to pay the price for that. They're going to pay the cost, not your team. Like you're resetting their clock. They were starting to settle into this environment, to this approach. They were starting to trust the language. They were starting to feel like they understood what to expect. And now they were adopted, or having to adapt to something new. Like you got relief, you're not bored. They got disruption, and their trust clock started over. So here's the diagnostic kind of question that I'd love for you to consider before this meeting we mentioned earlier. Before you walk in, I just ask this question. Are we solving a real problem here or a familiarity problem here? Right? And those aren't the same thing. And they do not get the same kind of responses. Like real problems are mostly system problems, and they show up in your data. Right? First-time guests who aren't returning after their initial experience, engagement that's flat or declining across ministry environments, groups, giving, serving, next steps that are kind of consistently being offered and consistently being ignored, right? People who have been, at the same stage of faith for years without any meaningful movement. So those are structural indicators. They tell you something in the design, and they tell you that, at least in the design, that is not producing the intended outcome. So when the data points there, change is very appropriate. In fact, it may even be overdue. But familiarity problems, they show up differently. They show up in like your staff meetings, your creative team meetings, because your creative team is restless. Creative people are always restless, right? The energy that launched something has kind of gone down, it doesn't feel as energetic. The conversation has shifted from like, how do we refine this to should we replace this? And listen, that is not a strategy problem. It's a leadership maturity challenge. And the solution is not a redesign. The solution is really probably more of a recalibration of how your team understands their role in the system. So they are not the audience. Remember that. The system was never meant for them. So here's kind of a concrete move that you can make. Before your next programming or planning meeting, what if you just pulled 90 days of your key metrics, right? Attendance trends and first-time guest retention rates and, next step responses, engagement, things like that. And then ask the question, looking at the data, does this data point to a system problem? If it does, make a change. You have the evidence you need because you have the data. And there's a real structural issue that is worth solving. But if the data is good, if the numbers are moving in the right direction and the restlessness is coming from your team rather than the data, right? Then you need to name what's actually happening in the room. And I would say it out loud. We are not the audience, right? Our boredom is not the reason to change or stop or rethink or remodel, okay? That is not, and listen, that is not a small statement. For a lot of church teams, this is a culture shaping moment because if you don't say it clearly, the default is to keep assuming that the team's felt experience of the system is the most reliable indicator of its effectiveness. And guess what? It isn't. Now, just one more quick thing on this. Some of you are actually listening and you're realizing you don't actually have the data to make this call. So you're not tracking things like first-time guest and any of those things reliably. So and you're not measuring next steps. You can't really see trends over time. All that's just hard for you, right? So if that's you, that's a real problem, and that's not attention. That's a problem, and I'd love to help you solve it. You need to solve that. So I recently built a tool called the Church Pulse, specifically for churches that are navigating this challenge. So it is a metric tracking scoreboard and an analysis tool. And it is designed to give you the right information for decisions just like this. If you want to learn more about that, just reach out to me directly, gavin@gavinadams.com. If you go to my website, gavinadams.com, very easy. If you go to the top right, you'll see something, or if you're on mobile, drop down. With the three lines. But you'll see something called Church Toolkit. It is sitting in that Church Toolkit. So I'd love for you to check that thing out. could really, really help you in your scoreboard metric space. So last thing this week, before your next planning conversation, as we said, ask that question I gave you. Pull the data, look at what it actually says. And if what you're sitting with is restlessness rather than evidence, just say it very clearly to the room, right? We are not the audience. Our boredom is not the reason to stop. That one sentence might be the most important leadership move that you can make, not even just the week, maybe this quarter, maybe even this year. So if you want to read about this, the blog is up live. There are links all through that. You can learn a little bit more about it. If you want to take notes on it, go ahead and go there, gavinadams.com/blog. Hey, thanks for being here again. As always, I'll see you in a few days.